Alma Katsu published The Hunger in 2018. It was her fourth novel. It was my first time reading her, and I'm happy to report this is not going to be my last time reading her. Most authors have a whole life before they actually have anything published, and Katsu is no stranger to this. She had 35-ish years in the government before she became a novelist, including time at the CIA, so that's, something. It is not a particularly long book, sitting at only 373 pages in trade paperback. That's about 133,000 words. Now, the genre is historical horror fiction with a bit of a supernatural bent to it. In general, I think historical fiction is kind of fun. One of the best parts about reading a historical fiction novel is getting to learn new things about history that you hadn't known previously. That's why I picked this up initially, actually, is because it is about the Donner Party, and so I wanted to learn a little bit more about some history that happened not too very far away from where I live. In any case, let's get on to the plot and the prose. A caravan of settlers known as the Donner Party travels west across the American frontier in hopes of finding fortune in California, only to find deepening horror with every mile. The integrity of the party is in question from the start, comprised of men and women with questionable history, but hubris and foolish hope drives them ever westward. People begin to disappear from the party, and the remains turn up further along the trail, grisly, brutalized, and fed upon. Who is responsible? Mountain wolves? A madman in the party? Or something inhumane, something lurking in the shadows just beyond the fire every night, something with an insatiable hunger? The book is written mostly in third-person limited. The prose itself was neither flowery nor particularly dry. It got everything across that it needed to, and it never lingered in any particular spot. Most books I accuse of being a little too long. Authors ramble just a wee bit too much. Granted, that might just be an effect of the books that I myself choose to read, so take that with a grain of salt. However, this book is very much the opposite. I actually think that The Hunger could and probably should have been expanded a little bit. Not that there needed to be any more plot or any extra characters added in. I would have just liked to have seen a little bit more description of the land, a little more description of day-to-day life, just a little bit more of the in-the-period type of stuff, the kind of things that I actually search out historical fiction for in the first place. Out of the very few criticisms that I have to level at this book, that's the heaviest criticism that I can give, is that I just wish that she would have spent, I'm going to say about 7,000 words variously throughout the book, just peppered them here and there. I really wish she would have just taken a little more time to kick her legs out and just expand, breathe a little bit, feel the frontier a little bit more. But honestly, if that is the worst thing that I can say about your book, I think you've done pretty well. To give it credit, though, it did have an incredibly fast pace. There was always something happening, there was always some kind of a character dynamic going on, or a moment that we're learning about the tensions between somebody, or a horror moment that's happening on, or something kind of grisly or gross being described, which didn't happen too often, but when it did happen, I was hoping for more, honestly, but for what there was, I was still satisfied. Moving on to the characters themselves, most of the characters here are actual real-life people that really existed. However, I believe in the afterword of the book, Katsu herself said that she did fictionalized some characters. She took out one character at one point and replaced him with somebody completely new because it just didn't work out for the plot line or whatever. In general, there weren't any characters that I absolutely loved, but there was none that I was bored with. I liked every character to the amount that you're supposed to, of course. The characters I wasn't supposed to like, I properly didn't like. Everybody in the story is running away from something in their past, trying to run westwards for various different reasons. Starting with Charles Stanton, you could arguably say that he is the protagonist. There's one other character that could also be the protagonist, but we'll get to her in just a moment. Stanton has a properly tragic background. He's on the run from, the history that he has. It's alluded to, but you don't directly get to see it for most of the book, but it is properly tragic, of course. Generally, I liked him. I sympathized with him a fair amount of the way. He wasn't, too hard-headed. He wasn't particularly rude or mean. I enjoyed the romance that we got to see as he was, that got to blossom throughout the book. That was kind of nice. Tamsin Donner is actually arguably the other protagonist of the book here. I might even say more so than Charles Stanton. I only bring up Charles Stanton because he shows up first in the book. Most of the party thinks that she is a witch, and As to whether or not she is, that's something you have to figure out as you read the book, but that does give some tensions between her and the rest of the people that she's traveling with. She was probably my favorite out of all the cast, a little bit ahead of Charles Stanton. She probably had the best arc throughout the story. Charles Stanton's character was just a tragic character. This whole book was a tragedy. She actually felt like she had more of an arc than anybody else, so that's, I think, probably why I ended up liking her better than anything else. Edwin Bryant is another character. He is a doctor that is venturing west. He hears of a strange disease, and so he's going out to go study it. He and Charles Stanton are friends, if I can recall correctly. They met during this expedition and kind of traveled a little bit together, even though he ends up venturing off and he's not with the group for most of the book. Bryant doesn't show up too often, but he is still very important to the plot itself. George Donner himself, the leader of the party, you would expect for him to show up more, given that this is a book about, the Donner Party, but no, actually, he's used fairly sparingly, and he is not the kind of guy that I expected. Granted, I didn't know very much about George Donner before the book started. I'm still not 100% certain how accurate it was towards his character, towards his real life character, that is. I've not done the additional research that I need to be able to do to determine that. But when it comes to a fictional narrative, he was very interesting. He was kind of meek. He was not the kind of person you would expect to be married to Tamsin, but it was interesting. The relationship that those two characters had together was, I'm not going to say fascinating to read about, but highly interesting for me at least. It would have been nice, I guess, to learn a little bit more about him. But again, I don't really think that there's anything that she could have added that wouldn't have jeopardized the pace. Now, granted, that's fine for me. I think she could have slowed down a little bit, but other readers might appreciate a faster pace than I do. The last character that I'm going to bring up is Louis Kesselberg. He is he's certainly the antagonist of this book. They make that pretty clear from the opening scene there. You get a heavy foreshadowing. Pretty gnarly character, not one of the greatest bad guys of all time by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly solid enough to keep this book rolling along. And it's not even like he's the main thrust of the story or anything like that. He's just one part of many different moving parts. There are, of course, the monsters out and about, tracking them down as well. So it's not like Kesselberg's the only antagonistic force in this story here, but he was, very well done. We are now on to the spoilers, so if you do not want any spoilers, have a good day. The only other real problem that I have with this book, other than it should have been expanded out a little farther, was that the whole thing between Tamsin and Stanton at the beginning just kind of felt irrelevant by the end of the book. The obvious thing that it felt like it was setting up was some sort of confrontation between George Donner and Charles Stanton, because, Stanton and Tamsin ended up having an affair together, so you feel like that's going to lead to something. It didn't necessarily feel out of character for George Donner to, not exactly care or bring up any confrontation about it. As a matter of fact, it did feel fairly in character, but it felt also like, why even have those relations between those characters, between Tamsin and Charles Stanton? Why have the relation at all? Because it didn't really have any bearing on the plot, at least that I noticed. Maybe there was something that, that it connected to that I just didn't know, or maybe there was some historical fact there and that's just a thing that happened, but why did she keep it in, per se? She has no problem with changing historical facts to match the narrative. She said so at the end of the book in the afterword, so why keep that? It didn't seem to necessarily bolster the narrative in any meaningful way. She really could have used that to tighten the vices later in the story, but she kind of chose not to, and I'm not sure why. That's really the biggest problem that I have with this book, aside from the fact that she just needed to slow down. If she fixed those two things, man, this would have been a great novel. But we'll rate it at the very end. Let's see here. I was just a little bit let down by the monsters when they did show up. I mean, not much, though. I don't want to paint this in a bad light here. The final criticism I can level is that it felt like the epilogue was just the tiniest little bit unnecessary. I mean, I feel like you could have assumed all of that at the very end, but I am really stretching to find any kind of a criticism about this book beyond the few that I've listed here. And so, in conclusion, I am just really happy with my time reading this book. I'm not certain this book is going to exactly have a whole ton of staying power with me. I don't think I'm going to continue to think about it a whole ton just because it didn't match a couple of the specific things that I require in reading for me to really love and deeply cherish. But man, wow, it was just a solid read and very fun, a little bit informative along the way. So I think I'm going to give this book a solid B. Although it was a little bit sparse for my taste, I was more than happy to follow each of the characters. The gore was infrequent but effective when used, and there was a consistent sense of dread and tragedy running all throughout. If Katsu would have just spent a little more time, given just a little bit more than what she had given us, I honestly might have even been able to bump this up to like an A- or something. But just for my own personal tastes, it just couldn't quite get there. Am I going to reread this? I'm not going to turn it down and say no. However, I am much more curious about going on to read Katsu's other work. My name is Damien, by the way. I'm also an author. I sell original fiction and used media at various markets around southern Arizona. Check my website for a calendar of various upcoming shows I'll be attending. I will be at the 2026 Tucson Comic-Con. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.